think a mere minister would need both arms all the time, would you? But you'd be wrong about that. Suicide, period. That's when anxiety or depression or the voices or the anger or the despair gang up on a person and they kill themselves. And the sentence that is their life ends. No more words. Full stop. Over. Suicide, semicolon, is when anxiety or depression or the voices or the anger or the despair gang up on a person who slows down, slows way down, and maybe peers over the abyss and takes a few steps and turns to inner or outer resources for help, and their lives go on. There's a movement in the teen and young adult world to help young people who think about suicide, think about ending their lives, to slow down, back up, and turn aside for help. It's the Semicolon tattoo movement, and you'll hear more about that in a few minutes. Before I start in on the main message of this sermon, which is, please don't put a period in your life, let me say that I'm talking this morning about suicides that happen in the midst of life, and not the issue of taking charge of one's dying. The terminally ill person who wants to die on their own terms is in a fundamentally different category than the person who has a future that is likely to be better than it feels right now. Sometimes called assisted suicide or compassionate choices, this is a different subject, this end-of-life suicide subject, a different sermon, and we'll do it next fall. Today, the topic is suicide in the middle of life. You're probably aware that rates of suicide are going up in this nation and in the world, but you may not know that unlike many dire sets of statistics, this one affects us all, rich and poor, highly educated and not so educated, liberal and conservative, spiritual, religious, and nothing. Suicide is no respecter of social categories or beliefs. It's the 10th most common cause of death in this nation. Here in New Mexico, it is the 8th most common cause of death. More people die each year in New Mexico of intentional self-harm than die of Alzheimer's disease. Some of the people in this room have been suicidal, and I imagine that many of us have known someone who was or is, and we've had to grieve someone who killed themselves, and we know that there's extra pain involved in that. The fact that it's a taboo subject makes it harder to talk about, and therefore harder to know what to say. And today, we're going to break that taboo. I make a practice, when a family allows me to, of speaking openly about suicide at the memorial service of someone who has killed themselves. This startles some attendees. I can see it in their faces. Non-UUs are sometimes surprised that a person who's killed themselves are permitted to have a service in the church or that there's a reception afterwards. They are still steeped in the pre-modern Christian attitudes towards suicide, which were, to say the least, severe and punitive. But for all the surprise, there's also gratitude and learning. Many people do not realize that most people who die of suicide suffer from an illness, most often depression. And most people don't realize that depression is a little like pneumonia. It is all at once, very common, most often treatable, and sometimes becomes such a galloping drain on a person that it is fatal. People tell me that learning that helps them to understand, to forgive, and to grieve the death of their friend or family member who killed themselves, to have the subject openly discussed. And so I try to. Some people don't talk about suicide because they think it would give despondent people ideas, but actually, people who have had fleeting thoughts or even are actively struggling with suicidal thoughts are relieved when someone will talk to them, will name what they're feeling and thinking, and that helps them get over any shame they might be feeling and get the help they need. It can be life-saving. But talking sympathetically about suicide and understanding the reasons people might kill themselves and being non-judgmental when people do kill themselves, because after all, we did not walk in their shoes. That's only one half the path we have to walk on this topic. Because the other half is to say very clearly that we desperately want people to give themselves a chance to live the life they were given to the fullest, even when it is terribly painful or desperately hard. We want this for people we love, and if we value the worth and dignity of all people, as you so often say they do, we want it in general. We want people to value their lives as they value others' lives. We want you to choose life, even when it's hard. We're realistic people. We know that life is sometimes hard and painful. Almost all of us have been somewhere there for shorter and longer periods of time. We all know about bad decisions and excruciating disappointments and that horrible feeling that something's happened that's going to change our lives forever. We've been there too. And more than a few of us know about depression and about those dreary days and sleep-deprived nights and months slogging through with no sunshine, sometimes fighting off an inner dialogue that says, it's just not worth it, and they'd be better off without you. But it's not true. We're better off with you. We know it's hard, and we want you to be a hero. In our society, the loudest voices against suicide have been religious voices, and that for a pretty long time. The church decided centuries ago that God forbids suicide and also hates people who are suicidal, and for many of those centuries punished suicide or punished the corpse of someone who committed suicide or punished the family of someone who committed suicide with shocking passion. Maybe that's why, when the Enlightenment gave us choices about spiritual paths and modern medicine started treating depression as an illness, not a moral crime, liberal philosophy kind of went overboard about suicide, and in too many places seemed to say, well, it's your life. Parents didn't say this, of course, just to be clear, and children didn't say it, and friends didn't say it, but philosophy seemed to say it, and that didn't help. Most people who consider suicide are suffering a very low mood, suffering a lot of negative inner self-talk, suffering the kind of mental state that tells us that whatever's going on, the bad economy or the horrible social scene or the relationship breakup or the failure or the bad decision, that scene is permanent, catastrophic, and will never get better. We'll never marry, never have a good job, always come in second, always blow it. That kind of self-talk is never an accurate picture of reality, and when it takes over, it can be very dangerous. When we feel that kind of pain, we should go to urgent care, just like we go if we have a pain in our chest. I would go so far as to say it's our duty to care for ourselves in that way, a duty that comes out of our faith. Now, this is not a your life belongs to God and he'll be mad argument. Even those of us who believe in that kind of God who wants us to choose life also, I imagine, believe that there's enough love and understanding there for those who suffer. Rather, this argument is a humanistic, this world-centered argument for life, based in what we know about people and communities. The first argument is that we humans are not individuals by nature. We are, by nature, parts of groups and families and clans and communities. And it hurts those groups, those families, those clans, and those communities when someone kills themselves. Suicide, as one person told me many years ago, leaves footprints on the heart, and not good ones. For while any death of someone we cared about brings us grief, suicide brings a host of other feelings that must be resolved, principally guilt, but also anger. Grieving is hard enough, and it's unavoidable in this world of connections. Dealing with the grief of suicide is a bigger, harder thing. Those of us who want to treat those around us gently will do whatever we need to do not to put our loved ones through that dark night. A second reason for someone who's feeling suicidal to keep slogging through their life is that suicide appears to be socially contagious. Just as a person is more likely to get drunk when there are others around who are drunk, so a rash of suicides can often be traced one by one to a first suicide. When one person ends their life, it seems to soften a barrier for those around them. Young people are particularly vulnerable to this social effect. Those of us who don't want to harm others also need to do whatever we can do to make sure that we don't harm them by making it easier for them to take their own lives. And then there's a somewhat different kind of argument against suicide, which reminds us that not only are we a self in community, but also in an important way, we're not just one self. Within this self that might decide today that life is not worth living are a large number of future selves which deserve a chance at life and growth and happiness. Most people who attempt suicide and survive are glad they did, and their future selves are glad. Things do get better. And here's yet another kind of argument, more spiritual than the others, because it assumes that human beings have a purpose in life, which is to grow in wisdom and in love. And ironically, the very suffering that causes suicidal thoughts is not only time-limited, but it is also one of the pathways to growth in wisdom and love, those very qualities that humanity most needs as it advances through its own terrible adolescence. So if you start feeling like killing or hurting yourself, especially if you start focusing in on a plan, we want you to get help. Your best bet is to call a crisis line, like the one listed in your order of service, because not only can they help by listening, and that in itself is often very helpful, but they know the best resources and steps to take next in your community, and they're not scared of a taboo topic, as even some medical people are. You don't even have to save the paper. Just Google suicide, and the numbers and chat lines come up first, wrapped up in a big box. Google's fixed it that way. Let that in itself remind you that we want you to live. If someone you know is struggling in this dark place, you too can call these hotlines for advice about how to help them. Don't keep suicide secrets for people. Friends get friends their help they need. After that, they respect their friends' privacy, of course. But first, they get help. If you want to talk to somebody you know, you can call me or Angela any hour of the day or night. It's part of what we do, and there is nothing we would rather do than listen and help and keep you and us together. One promising project that's new in suicide prevention is the Tattoo Project, and Ian Carrillo is going to tell us about that.
I got my semicolon tattoo, this one right here, about 8 months ago. It was sponsored by a project run by UNM's Agora Crisis Center, a 24/7 hotline you can call to talk anonymously about anything. Now, as you heard, the semicolon represents that moment when you can stop, end your sentence, it's over, it's done, but instead you choose to keep on going, to continue the sentence, to add to it. It's a long pause. It makes you stop and consider what came before it and look forward to what comes after. A lot of people get this tattoo on their wrist. It serves as a visual reminder when they go in to hurt themselves or when they feel the urge to end their sentence. I got mine behind the ear because I'm fortunate enough not to have experienced serious suicidal thoughts. The purpose of mine was not to give myself a reminder, but rather to open up a dialogue, to get people asking about this punctuation mark on my head, and hopefully to bring a taboo subject out of the dark a little bit. Now, let's just say I'm used to some negative emotions. I work tech support. Well, one day I got called up to somebody's office to fix her ancient computer, and it took a while to boot up. While I was sitting in her chair, she, standing behind me, noticed my tattoo, and we struck up a conversation. She's in her late 50s, approaching the end of her career, and she told me about a friend of hers who had attempted suicide. That friend luckily didn't succeed and got some much-needed help afterwards, but continued for a while to practice self-harm and experience suicidal thoughts. Self-harm. I never imagined I'd be talking about self-harm with a silver-haired coworker while I waited for her computer to finish updating. I told her I'd had several friends who'd made it through high school by cutting or burning. Self-harm is something a lot of people don't understand. Each of my friends injured themselves, mutilated themselves, because it took away their anxiety. It brought them back to earth and reduced their desire to kill themselves. It was the lesser of two evils, but they couldn't talk about it. There's a tremendous amount of guilt and societal taboo for having these feelings. One particular friend of mine only wears long sleeves. She feels her family and community judge her for the scars on her arms. And the only reason I know this is because of my semicolon. She knows she can talk to me now, and she calls Agora Crisis Center when she needs to, and it's helped a lot. Anyway, my coworker's friend ended up getting the semicolon tattoo as well, on her wrist. It served not only as a reminder for herself, but it got her support, sometimes from people she didn't even know. At this point, my coworker admitted to me that she herself had struggled with severe depression since adolescence. We'd been talking for several minutes. The computer had updated, it was fixed. She told me about her childhood and a personal experience with suicide. We discussed the taboo against the subject of suicide. It's the topic that everyone is aware of, but for which public awareness seems to be lacking. The conversation doesn't come up, and to have suicidal thoughts and urges is isolating. Finally, it was time to get back to work. I stood up and she put a hand on my shoulder, and I'll never forget what she said to me. Sometimes, she said, you can find support in people you wouldn't expect. What remained unsaid was even in the tech support guy. That conversation was why I got the semicolon tattoo. It bridged the generational gap. It got a discussion moving about a very important topic, and it showed both of us that there's always someone to talk to. If you're interested in the Agora Crisis Center or the Semicolon Tattoo Project, Maya Stevenson volunteers there. She and I will be free to talk during the social hour. I want to conclude with something I've learned through the conversations this tattoo has created. You have worth. You have dignity. When you feel like it's too much, when you feel like you have no one to talk to, when the world just doesn't seem worth it anymore, pause. That period you just wrote, change it to a comma. Add a little dot on top. Continue your sentence. You're worth it.
There's not really very much more to say after that other than thank you, Ian. Thank you for caring. Thank you for sharing. And that this gift of our lives is too precious, even when things are very hard, to bring it to an early end. So choose life. Our closing hymn this morning is number 128.